Alrighty, friends, welcome back to another week of the Modern Meathead Experience here. Ethan, it's been a while since we've chatted. We haven't spent much time together recently. What have you been up to in the last week? Tell me, tell the people what you've been up to.
Well, I just landed last night from Costa Rica, specifically the Osa Peninsula.
Wow.
I was staying with a couple in the jungle, and
Very intimate, it sounds.
one of these situations where we took a plane to another plane to a 4x4, and we were deep in the jungle away from civilization. No ayahuasca involved, but lots of good food, lots of monkeys. Lots of time on the beach, time in the jungle. Overall, very refreshing week. And how about yourself?
Yeah, so weirdly enough, I did something similar. I also went to Costa Rica. I was also in the Osa Peninsula. Um, a lot of monkeys, a lot of good food. Um, a lot of driving on unpaved roads, etc. Went to this national park. It was really cool. I always like being in nature, at least for a couple of reasons. I don't like being in nature for many other reasons, but one of the reasons that I do like is, or one of the reasons I like it is because you get to see how many structures in nature repeat themselves, specifically in relationship to like human anatomy, so you're seeing like branches that look like specific bones or plants that look like specific muscles, or it's part of that could be I'm just I'm seeing what I want to see, but there were many cool things that we sort of saw along the way. Yeah, so um anyway, that was a fun trip. We had a good time. I only gained about, normally on Sunday, like my normal Sunday weight is what I would wake up as is like 197, 196, and it was only 200, So despite the fact that we ate that much food, not too much heavier, but week of clean stuff. I'm back to my normal routine here. So oh yeah, and I was also impressed by your ability to not work out and to be comfortable not working out. In those types of situations, I do feel a little bit of discomfort about like, not getting in the gym and not you just the irrational sort of sense of like, uh, I'm going to work out this week or else, and then it's kind of like, well, what's really going to happen? So it was nice to kind of see, that in you and that you have that ability. You always kind of had the sort of switch flipping ability, which I think could be really helpful to people who are kind of at a lower level of hypertrophy advancement, just to kind of be like, hey, big guys can do this. And in many ways, it was like intentional, purposeful for you. So anyway, if you want to start us off with something related to that or unrelated to that, um, let's just jump right into it.
Yeah, let's do it. So, as you know, I've been putting together a lecture for the Circle members group on failure training. And as our conversations often do, there's many tangents you can go on from failure. We can talk about topics like fatigue, for example, when then fatigue can uh, sort of snowball into things like overtraining. We can talk about the like perception of fatigue and all the things that go into sort of the psychological, all of the psychological factors that go into that, both sort of environmentally and internally inside your body. But one of the tangents that has just been kind of coming up on my walks, or, as we say here, sort of hot takes that might happen in the sauna, is just sort of visualizing this dose response curve and examining the concept of more is more. And when we think about a dose response curve, as we talked about on this podcast before, a lot of times it's characterized as like an inverted U in regards to hypertrophy, where you're getting more for doing more. And basically, in this particular example, it's you're doing more sets and you're getting more hypertrophy, or in the case of training to failure, maybe you're going closer to failure. So, i.e., you're doing more reps and you get more muscle growth. And then there's this hypothetical spot where that no longer occurs, where essentially the fatigue outpaces the adaptations, and you start to have a negative effect or a regression. And just delving more into like what I think the shape of that curve is, examining the differences between how that plays out on the group level and what that looks like on the individual level, I think is really important. And also understanding how we're plotting that curve, because a lot of times the way we imagine it is on the x-axis, we're adding sets sequentially, one set at a time from, say, one set to infinity or zero sets to infinity. And then on the y-axis, we might be plotting, did I get that backwards? Y-axis, we're plotting hypertrophy. Yeah, I think I have that right. I'm just visualizing in my mind. So
Mhm.
we're plotting muscle growth on the y-axis. And the idea is that even though we're not really observing it in the research that's being done, there's some hypothetical place where on a group level, doing more sets as measured by volume causes some sort of a regression. And I think just examining the definitions around that and examining the way we look at that curve and examining what happens on the individual level are all things that have been kind of swirling around in my head. So I'll start with just the idea of how we plot that curve, which is, as I mentioned a moment ago, increasing sets linearly on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, we see sort of this like relative change in muscle growth. And I think one of the problems with looking at it that way, because when we look at it that way, just to kind of skip ahead, we get sort of this logarithmic curve. We get this asymptote where you're adding sets and you get more benefit for muscle growth in the beginning, but then over time it sort of appears to trail off, where you get less and less benefit as you're adding more and more sets, like per unit of set. So going from 1 to 2 sets and then 2 to 3 sets gives you more benefit on a relative basis than going from, say, 20 to 21 sets, 21 to 22 sets. So you can picture this curve kind of like flatten out, but never quite reach zero over time. And that's sort of a theoretical group level observation. I think that's like where things are kind of trending towards, is like more is better, but you also get less return on more over time. But if you plot that graph in with both of those values operating in a relative sense, so it's not going from a linear increase of 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, but you look at it as a relative change in sets. So it's a doubling from 1 to 2, from 2 to 4, from 4 to 8, from 8 to 16, from 16 to 32. And then you plot that against sort of an absolute change in hypertrophy. I think that curve starts to look a lot more linear. So I think sometimes we're just looking at it the wrong way, whereas we're saying like, oh, as there's less and less effect of adding a set, but if you look at just like changing the volume or changing the number of sets on a relative basis, going from 10 to 20, it looks like we still see sort of that linear increase in hypertrophy. So I think that's just another
Mm.
way to frame it is it really an asymptote, or are we just looking at it? Are we just sort of graphically representing it in the wrong way?
Yeah, really, really, that was really, really interesting because the first time that you said that, the first time you said that it didn't land the same way for me. And the way that I want to describe it for people in case, and you can tell me if this is accurate or inaccurate, in case it's unclear to anyone, is the normal sort of hypertrophy curve we're looking at in terms of how much hypertrophy do we receive per unit of volume. The normal curve is not this thing that we look at as a straight line, but is rather this thing that kind of starts maybe as a straight line and then sort of curves downward to sort of represent like a decreased return on investment. But what you're saying is that that shape of the curve, shape of the graph is really just an artifact of the specific jumps that we're making between the x-axis measurements. So, for example, if I am, let's say, 300-pound bodybuilder, and I add a pound of body weight to myself, that's a very, very low percentage of my body weight that I'm adding. But if I weigh 100 pounds, right, I'm adding a lot more weight, even though I'm still adding the same pound. I'm adding a much larger percentage of my body weight. And so what you're saying is in this particular case, what we have historically looked at as the appropriate graph for hypertrophy relative to sets might be a little bit not not uh, not necessarily inaccurate relative to the way that it's done, but just more so that per unit of volume, we should maybe take the framework of looking at things on a percentage basis rather than an absolute number. So rather than saying we're going from 5 sets to 10 sets, we would say something like we are 200x or 2xing our volume. Or if we're going from 5 sets to 15 sets, we're 3xing our volume rather than saying we're adding 10 sets. Does that kind of make sense, or do you think that was maybe made things more confusing?
No, I'm sure that made things more clear because I've only really mentioned this to you and it's kind of inside of my head. So I'm just spilling it out as it comes. But yeah,
Question. I have a question for you though. So do you think that like let's say like if there's like an Ethan graph and like a graph for my mom who just starts training, um not that we would make a graph for my mom who just started training, but do you think that like per individual that the relationship, I think about a good way to say this, do you think that like that kind of concept applies across the board, or do you think, okay, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was getting to is I'm just starting with like group level observations, which, as I alluded to in the introduction, are not necessarily what you see on an individual level. So I think it's useful to just look at the trend of sort of like the species as a whole and say like, hey, this is what's happening. If we want to move the entire population in a direction, this is what would happen on average. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what happens for each individual, within that plot.
Mhm.
So I think that's kind of the starting place is just like, what is the general trend when we have, tens of thousands of subjects, across all the studies that have kind of compared changes in volume to changes in hypertrophy? Like, what's the general trend that we get? And so far, my interpretation of it is depending on how you graph it. I don't think one way is right or wrong, but I just think you could look at it as an asymptote if you're looking at, how much, if you're asking the question, like on average, if I have a group, of 100 people or so, and, I add a set, what can I expect, my returns to be as far as hypertrophy? That's a valid question. But it's not the same question when you just say like, if I am trying to increase, is there a sort of decreasing dose response, or is it a linear dose response? I think when you're asking that question, you might want to frame it more in a relative sense. And then you could say, well, we are still pretty much looking at a group level of sort of a linear dose response in a sense, not maybe not in a traditional sense, but still, and I think in a very valid sense, you're still doing more and getting more.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think maybe the next concept I'll tackle is just stay on the group level and talk about the idea of overtraining, which is sort of the right side of this curve, which is right now all we've really observed is this, asymptote or linear dose response, depending on how you graph it. But there's no real regression. There's no real like inverted U to it. Where on the other side, we have this like trailing off. This in endurance research, it's the definition of overtraining has much more to do with when you actually start to regress and then you don't get back to your baseline performance for something like months. And sometimes in like the exercise science research, we can take a concept from um, another modality, and because it was defined there, carry over that definition and act as if it should be strict, in our realm as well.
It's just like it says like strength from powerlifting. It's like everything now related to strength is like what's your 1 RM on squat, bench, deadlift.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of irrelevant for the average person. It's just become sort of common parlance. And where else do we see this kind of like carryover? So yeah, overtraining is a big one. I had another one. I'm sure that'll come back to me in a second. But oh, it was intensity. Like when we were talking about training intensity on the last time we did these hot takes, it was just simply that in research, intensity was a percentage of 1 rep max. And now, especially in regards to like training for hypertrophy, a lot of times we're talking about proximity to failure in terms of like a relative intensity or RIR, RPE kind of thing. So sometimes these terms get mixed up as we move from like one discipline to another within the same field. And I think that's kind of where we're at with the overtraining thing. Is a lot of times we'll say, well, we haven't really seen overtraining in research at all, because the way it was defined in research for endurance sport was an actual decrease in performance and not being able to get back to baseline for a period, oftentimes of months on end. And I look at that just like you see that happen much more readily in endurance sports over things like strength and power sports. And I sort of just chalk that up to basically what everything comes back to, which is survival and reproduction. And that there are certain qualities that we're just able to survive much more of and are much more valuable for the overall like survival of the species, and thus are sort of more um, sort of less perturbed by fatigue, right? So for example, we see with just these short-term bursts of strength and power that acute fatigue doesn't seem to really modify them as much as you would see with endurance. So there's something to being able to, in a life or death situation, produce high degree of force, and that seems to be something that isn't as modifiable by acute fatigue. And an example would be like sleep deprivation. Um,
Mm.
Also, I think you're just able to survive such a high volume of endurance training that you just become capable of sort of deteriorating other systems, where it's just like we as a species are capable of feats of endurance that many other species that are sort of like higher on the chain as far as strength and power cannot. And I think that just allows you to do such a high volume of work that you can see some breakdown in other areas, and we can measure that more readily.
Mhm.
Whereas a lot of times in strength and power, just something else breaks first. Like usually you're going to just break orthopedically before the actual like adaptive processes and sort of biochemical processes become the rate limiting step. Um, so it's kind of just getting back to this idea of overtraining and how we look at that in resistance exercise, because we say, well, we haven't really found this like tail end of the inverted U, where we actually start decreasing performance on the group level. And this is where these like 50 set studies come in, and things that are like 30 plus sets, and people on average still seem to be growing a little bit more than they would doing less sets. And there's some arguments about study design and things like that when you get into these really high set studies, but still we're not seeing that the group peaking at 50 sets or so is actually starting to lose muscle mass. And then we could say, well, does like overtraining even exist? Yeah, it probably does, but no one's going to get there, kind of thing. And I think, one, we don't necessarily need to look at overtraining as like a regression where you're losing muscle mass. It can simply just be the point where you're making less progress than you would have doing less. So
Hmm.
if you would have made, X amount of progress doing 20 sets, and then you go up to 25, and now it's like an X minus one type of thing, where you would have actually made more progress doing 20 sets than 25 sets. That is, I think, maybe even a greater hot take than the idea of looking at sort of the dose response curve in a relative versus an absolute sense. Is just that I believe, at least in practice, you can do more and actually see less progress without regression.
Mm.
So all you need to do is look at a study where you have participants, switching between different volumes, whether they do sort of like a study where they're training one limb and then they go and train the other limb, or they train one way for a while and they train the other way for a while. It's not like you don't see people who make more progress doing less sets. So this kind of gets into the individual data point perspective versus just looking at it on the group level. You absolutely do see people who make more progress doing less volume. And then you have to ask, why is that? Is that like a mechanistic thing? Is that just something behaviorally that's going on? And I wouldn't even want to speculate exactly as to what that would be, but I would just point out that it clearly happens. We measure it, where there are individuals who make progress doing less volume than more. So I think as we move into this concept of overtraining, and we move into the concept of the dose response curve on an individual level, one, that the dose response curve on an individual level doesn't necessarily follow the group in this sort of logarithmic or linear upward trend where um, you never see less return on investment. You never see that inverted U. I think in practice, there sort of is an individual inverted U, whether it's just behavioral, whether it's some outside limitation, some outside rate limiting step like orthopedic health, or whether it's actually at the chemical level where it's something like, oh, you're just producing so much muscle damage that even though you are creating, even though you're creating muscle growth, you're sort of driving protein synthesis on one end. You're also driving breakdown on the other end, and there may just be a place where your net return isn't as favorable as it would be if you did a little bit less. So who knows, again, why it is, but I think it's pretty observable that on the individual level, sometimes people get more out of doing less. And that becomes then very difficult to just make a prescription for an individual by saying, like, just do as much as you can until you can't. And I think that is kind of like the common thread with not the people who are sort of like um, at the top tier of interpreting this research and have a really nuanced view, but maybe when they post things sort of illustrating the dose response curve or just saying more volume is better, that there are people that sort of downstream that sort of take that to mean, for me, I should just do more until I physically can't survive it anymore. And that's the optimum dose. So that's the hot take in general, is I don't think the optimum dose is necessarily the most that you can survive.
Mhm. Yeah, so I want to it's really funny just for the listeners that you brought this up because I don't know really what you're going to bring up you in the same way that you don't know what I'm going to bring up. Um but someone in the community either yesterday or 2 days ago posed the question to the community, which was, I'll just read it. They said, I've often heard this term overtraining. And I think that I've overtrained in the past. Can anyone please help me understand what people mean by overtraining? And I think that's probably a really common thought that people have, but not a common question that people have, which is like we just hear these terms like, oh, you are overtraining or you're not overtraining, and we assume that it's whatever happens to be the definition of it could be like a simple story. And one of the things that um, I always wonder with these kinds of terms is like not necessarily because everyone kind of has like a feeling of what they mean by it. Like, oh, I kind of can feel what someone is trying to say when they say I've overtrained. Um, but like wherever that person happens to just be drawing a line in the sand is kind of it feels like something that's just super subjective, right? Because just take a very simple example of like if you say I'm overtraining and you're basing that off of, let's say, like you're not making progress in the bench press, but you look at your squat or you look at your dumbbell curls and all those things are improving week to week in terms of the load, then like, well, are you overtraining or is it something specific to the motion? I oftentimes think that it has to do with like people's analysis of their overtraining has to do with just a couple motions, like they might just not be making progress in a specific lift, or maybe they are genuinely just like falling short of a lot of thresholds in relationship to nutrition and sleep, which is often the case. Maybe they're just simply not tracking anything. So it feels like, every single week there's like a different level of fatigue. And so there's just like so many different things that are interacting here. But what I said in response to this particular question, and I'll make a sort of addendum to it now, I think based on what you just said, I said that the most concise way to define overtraining might be when we achieve a state wherein total stress has exceeded our tolerance or capacity to handle that stress. But what I might adjust that to say, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that particular tidbit, might be that it's not necessarily like overtraining isn't necessarily when we've like exceeded a tolerance or a capacity, in the sense that it's not like this switch that gets turned off, but it's more like a spectrum where we can still be making progress, but not as much as we maybe would at a previous point, with maybe let's say like lower volume. So like just take your example, 20 sets, we're making whatever we can call optimal progress for a muscle group. And then 25 sets is maybe like we're still making progress, but just a little bit less. It's not like we can't recover from the 25 sets, but we're just, there's some kind of balance of things that is maybe distorting the outcome in that particular case. And just one other thing before I hand it to you is that a lot of people said, like just in response, because there are many responses to this, but the common thread that I noticed between all responses was basically this notion that like you just did too much, number one, and or you're not able to recover from the previous session. And that is kind of like a whole nother tangent, maybe, which is this concept of like recovery and how we're actually measuring recovery. And so something that I wanted to kind of pose to you as a follow-up to this was like, when we're talking about recovery, like, am I recovered or am I not recovered for a particular workout? Do you just base that off of load and how much you're able to do? Or do you have to kind of stretch that timeline out on a much longer or larger scale to be able to assess something like recovery and what we even mean by recovery? So I don't know where you want to take that, but that just those were a lot of things that came up. And then also, a lot of similar questions are coming up in the community about it.
I think a lot of people who are strongly on the science side, but maybe less so on the application side, will sometimes take a definition that was made a long time ago by someone under a different context, But it has just been, republished over and over again, just repeated in the literature, and look at that as like, well, we need some type of baseline, we need some type of scientific agreement on the term so that we can move forward. And I do think conceptually that's very important. Like, even if the definition isn't really getting at what we care about, we still need to be speaking the same language. So language is extremely important in science. But sometimes when they're so strongly focused on the language and the sort of scientific terminology, you might lose sight of what actually matters under the context that we're talking about. So in this case, with overtraining, I don't think the definitions and research really match what people in our realm care about, and they're not really applicable to the goal at hand. So at that point, maybe you just use a different word. I think that's what often happens. It's like it was just some guy or some girl sitting around defined overtraining, right? It's not like it was handed down in the Ten Commandments or whatever. Like someone like you or I had to make that decision at some point,
Yeah.
and then it was just carried forward. And then, sort of in a colloquial sense, we might use that same word, and it might carry that same meaning for a scientist, but not the same meaning for the average person. So maybe we just use a new term altogether so that there's not just this like this back and forth and this general just like unrest that comes along with people who want to be really strict to a term that was sort of given to something that was in fact very different in the past. Um, in this particular case, I think the population we're talking about is looking simply for like, what's the dose that's going to give me the best outcome? It's not so much about finding the dose that you can tolerate.
Hmm.
So maybe in sport, it may have to do more with tolerance. So it's just simply how many pitches can this guy throw? How many miles can this woman run? And when you have to perform come hell or high water, it's about performance. It's not about adaptation. So that's where in sport you might see certain practices that are actually negative for adaptation, but are positive for acute performance. Say like the use of NSAIDs or ice baths or something. A person who's trying to grow muscle might say, well, why would I ever, do an ice bath after lifting or take NSAIDs? Whereas some, 7 foot tall guy running on a hardwood surface, that might be the exact thing he needs between games to just be able to go out and repeat his performance from last time. So when we're talking about the world of sport science, sometimes the goals are very different than the goals of physique sport or general population, whether it be health or whether it be growing muscle or whether it be an adaptation that's sort of a summation of things like strength. It's very different than just allowing someone to express their performance on a given day.
Mhm.
So in this sense, I think what people really care about is just simply like, what's optimal, bro? Like what's the optimal amount of sets, for me on this day and this week and this month, this year, whatever. And optimal in that context just simply means like, what's the highest return that I can get, regardless of the investment. And then you might also look at it as, well, what's the relationship between that investment and the return? And that's sort of where those asymptotes come into play as well. So, for example, like if I overspent on something, like when we were in the airport and I was looking to buy a dog toy to bring home, and there were like $35, for these little stuffed animals. Like if I overspent on that, it doesn't mean that I don't get the dog toy. I just spent more, than I would have liked to, and I got the same, toy.
Mhm.
Or I could spend more, like that's kind of the way I think of fancy food is like there's a certain point where spending more doesn't make the food taste any better. It's
Mhm.
just like more awkward service and like smaller portions.
Yeah.
Um, so I think at least in practice it can be similar here, whether the rate limiting step is something that's just like behaviorally or environmentally based, or the rate limiting step is truly something that's physiological in nature. There definitely is a point where you're doing more and maybe not only getting less benefit per unit of more, where it be more reps, more sets, etc. But you may also get slightly less progress in the thing that you care about as you add more. And I'm just sort of evidencing that based on practical experience, in observation, and then also just in the research. You don't simply see that the people who, on an individual level, make progress doing less sets, regress when they do more. Like, wouldn't that be interesting? Like, if you had a group that did 32
Yeah.
sets, a group that did 16 sets, and you're like, well, every time the person that makes more progress from 16 sets actually gets smaller during 32.
Mhm.
That's not what we see, is that there's just some like ceiling where you do more, you do more, you do more, and then all of a sudden you fall off the cliff and you actually regress.
I
It's
have just to draw a parallel. I kind of feel like at this point, this is what people look at like short position training like. That like people are now viewing length and position training as the thing that like, 50% growth in X amount of weeks. And then if I do any short position thing, I'm gonna go backwards. I think that's how people are looking at that
yeah,
now. But yeah, I think that much like you referenced earlier, in relationship to terms and how different cultures sort of like appropriate different terms from certain areas. So like a lot of stuff that we use comes from a lot of terms we use come from strength and conditioning, or like weightlifting or powerlifting or something like that, or endurance sport. Um, I think a lot of the perception around, um, or just a lot of the thoughts around overtraining come from powerlifting, because like when people are powerlifting on a consistent basis and they're actually pushing like high volumes, let's say like of bench press or deadlift or squats, it's very acutely noticeable in terms of if on the previous week I did 8 sets of deadlifts, and the next week I do deadlifts again, and I'm just like completely thrashed. And so instead I do 4 sets the following week. Then the week after that, it's like my deadlift all of a sudden feels amazing. So there's like subjectively, there's much more of a fluctuation, and the load oftentimes will match that subjective fluctuation. So then what people start to assume is that maybe that concept then applies to like quote unquote hypertrophy style training, where every week, even if we don't notice X amount of more pounds lifted or X amount of more reps lifted, that in fact that we are going backwards rather than continuing to go forwards. But it's weird because in powerlifting, as powerlifters kind of notice that, they just like make these little tweaks, these adjustments, and over time, and any high level powerlifter will tell you this, it's like they just know like exactly how much volume they can tolerate, exactly how much space between doses and I'm talking like advanced people, like you get to the point where it's like I'm squatting every 10 days or so, and if I do more than that, I'm going to basically like fall back into injury patterns or whatnot. So I think that a lot of lessons can maybe be learned from that, specifically if you're a power lifter. But much like you said, we're kind of maybe focused on the wrong things as it relates to building muscle. So maybe a simple takeaway from what you said would be something like, all roads should kind of lead back to, am I growing as much muscle as possible, rather than do I feel like I'm recovering every single week, or am I doing as much as I can while I'm still recovering, whatever that happens to mean. So just this kind of focus more toward the end goal, as we commonly talk about, versus this tangential thing, which may be interesting, but also potentially misleading and very difficult to measure in most cases. Does that kind of make sense as like a just maybe just a practical takeaway?
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's right now we're at a place where it's so difficult to measure hypertrophy on the individual level, which is why we need so many subjects and we don't get a lot of subjects in studies. Then we need meta-analyses to really unravel these sort of questions. So it's really difficult on the individual level to assess if you're growing muscle or not. So we still use performance as a proxy, but not a proxy of how much muscle you're growing, but literally just like, is your training permissive of growth? Like, I don't think most people would make the argument that over time getting weaker, that like your performance decreasing over a long stretch of time is a is an intelligent way to plan your hypertrophy training.
Mhm.
So it I think we have to look at things sometimes just like being permissive and not necessarily as like being a linear relationship. So we can't say that like, oh, if I gain strength faster, then I'm necessarily growing muscle faster, even though you might see that on the group level. Like you'll certainly see that people who are beginners are going to be increasing their strength faster than people who aren't. But there's things you can do acutely to modify that and give the appearance of increasing strength faster.
Mhm.
And that appearance of getting stronger is not necessarily linked to whether you're growing muscle. So, say if you just like switch to a new exercise variation, you're going to make progress really fast. You're going to see the numbers go up really quickly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that changing exercises is the key to muscle growth because of how quickly you see those performance increases. But I think in general, like things like a body weight trend over time that is going upwards, uh, and that time scale depends again on how advanced you are in regards to just like how much muscle you built previously, what your rate of progress is. But I do generally think like an upward trend of some sort in regards to body weight, an upward trend of some sort in regards to performance within certain contexts. All those sort of things give you an indication that growth can occur, and it's over time much more stacking up those factors than it is just looking at any one on an individual level. And I think more than anything over time, what we see is people run into one of those things being like a rate limiter, not necessarily focusing on how much you can bolster a specific one.
Mhm.
So that's kind of a little bit also a foreshadowing, like another hot take, which is just simply like if you are not taking care of those other rate limiting steps, does doing more in a specific is doing more in a specific area really worth it? Everyone's so focused on training volume, but if you're at an intermediate stage and you don't have the food in place and the sleep in place, and you're expecting a certain rate of progress and you're driving one of those faster than you should be, so in the opposite direction, like anyone is just moving too fast or too slow, I think those things all kind of have to play together. And if you're aware of the fact that you're not willing to do one of those things, or it's just you're just not capable at a certain time period, is it really worth just bolstering one to like a super high degree where you're just saying like, okay, I'm going to bring my training up as high as I can? um, is it more about kind of just timing that with the other factors? That's kind of my opinion in general. Is it should be about bringing up sort of the low hanging fruit, the rate limiting step, not just overly focusing on one area, because that's where I think you start getting really low returns on investment, is just focusing on one specific area and trying to sort of shoot that to the moon. So again, it kind of comes back to that dose response curve on an individual level. Is you could say, well, adding more sets, gets me more benefit. That's what I see on the group level. But on the individual level, there has to be other things in play in order to see that play out.
Yeah, and it's also like, what does the individual set look like? Like, what ingredients are you cooking with as well?
Mm.
Um, because doing 20 sets of garbage might be 20 sets on paper, and doing 5 sets of something that's just like full on to the house, super specific, anchored, locked in, drop set. Like it's just like a set is not a set. And that obviously becomes a different conversation, I think. But I really do um in my personal experience, the way that I feel like I can help people most is not necessarily through like educating them about the programming, but more so in the sense of like, what does the quality of your volume currently look like? Let's like look at that before we start to worry about the X's and O's of, should I do this many sets or this many sets? Obviously you can do both of those at the same time, but oftentimes I feel like things like volume, and like how much I should do for what muscle groups, start to become maybe a little bit more clear when we just get more specific about the goal, and then what we need to do to maybe, from an exercise specific standpoint, move ourselves closer to accomplishing a particular goal in a specific setting. Because it's like, how do you count volume of like a bent over row versus just a chest supported row? Just even one distinction like that can throw a wrench in what someone calls X amount of sets per week for a given muscle group. So I think that's a really good stopping point. Didn't expect a podcast on overtraining, but I think it was really good timing with just the stuff happening in the community. So I'll be interested to hear kind of what people's response to this is, and then maybe we can do a kind of follow up with some Q&A or something like that. Did you have anything else to add, just as a sort of closing remark, or are we good to go here?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. Like you said, that wasn't the intention to make it an overtraining podcast, but that's the nature of these things. We're just kind of like shooting from the hip here.
All right, awesome, and we'll see everyone next week. Thanks for listening.